radical become barely adequate. And those are the times that we live in, and I hope Obama grasps this sooner rather than later. I completely agree that the bailout has been a total failure. I wrote a piece last week arguing that it would be much more straightforward and effective if the government simply took some of this money and nationalized one or two banks. Then the government-owned bank could resume lending, would not have to worry about paying dividends because there wouldn't be any shareholders, would not have to worry about executive bonuses because these would be civil servants. And a lot of the civil servants at places like the FDIC are a lot more competent at running banks than most of the bankers these days. But these half measures of throwing money at banks and then not realizing how much leverage you have, probably because Paulson still views himself as a Wall Street's guy in Washington who just happens to be occupying the post of Treasury Secretary rather than the instrument of America's citizens and taxpayers. So you need a radical change in the way the Treasury Department views the task of recapitalizing American banks and getting credit flowing again. You're not going to get this by any kind of variation in the Paulson plan. Obama would be right to resist Paulson's overtures to buy into this. It's a disaster. But it could be done right. And if you look at today's headlines, each European country is struggling with how to do its version of this right. And Obama has a couple of people on his team who are much more progressive than either Summers or Geithner or the rest of the crowd. One of them is Dan Tarullo, who's the best banking expert on the team and also a true progressive. Reich is also in the mix. So I am a little worried about who's going to get these top jobs, but I think the jury is still out on what kind of policy Obama is going to ultimately pursue, not because he's not a centrist. His history is that of a centrist. But I think events are going to force him to be bolder, more progressive, the same way they did with Roosevelt.
Bob Kuttner, what about Roosevelt? I mean, we're talking about going from Hyde Park to, Hyde Park, right? From New York to Illinois.
Right.
What happened in those first 100 days? In fact, Roosevelt wasn't Roosevelt at the very beginning, the Roosevelt we know of the New Deal. It took tremendous pressure from within his cabinet. Of course, they were people he appointed. Adam Cohen, the editorial writer for the New York Times, has a very important book coming out on exactly what happened in those 100 days. But, Bob Kuttner, you also write about it, how people struggled within the administration, like Francis Perkins, Henry Wallace, who became his vice president, Harry Hopkins, the social worker, and how they beat out the more conservative forces.
Well, and they had two things on their side. They had reality on their side. If Roosevelt didn't become bolder, he would have been Hoover all over again. They also had social movements. And if you look at the great presidents, Lincoln, Roosevelt, the Johnson of the Civil Rights era, not the Johnson of Vietnam, you had the abolitionist movement. You had the industrial labor movement. You had, of course, the civil rights movement. And I think there's going to be a tug-of-war inside the administration. And the really interesting question is, what is going to happen to the youth movement that became an Obama movement that I think needs to become its own movement for social change, not simply Obama groupies? And I think there's a lot to celebrate, obviously, in the election of Obama. But we need a social movement to stand on its own 2 feet and push Obama when he needs to be pushed, the same way Dr. King and the civil rights movement pushed Johnson, the same way the abolitionists pushed Lincoln, the same way the labor movement pushed Roosevelt. And the great presidents actually pushed the social movements to put pressure on themselves so that they could break logjams in Congress. It's a very interesting dynamic, the way social movements interact with presidents.
I mean, Arun Gupta, Indypendent, Democracy Now!, we cover grassroots movements. This massive grassroots movement that elected President Obama, soon to be, was also coordinated by an extremely well-resourced community organizing strategy, what the Republicans mocked in Barack Obama as a community organizer. But the other part that might work against us now is that extremely well-resourced, right? The money and those who gave it. at the bottom, the people at the grassroots, you had a 10 million person email text list for Barack Obama. They were coordinating from the top. How do they reorganize themselves, not by themselves, not as a tool of the state, because Barack Obama becomes now the head of state?
Well, that's true. The amount of money spent was absolutely insane. Back in 2000, we were lamenting how much was spent on the presidential contest. And just 8 years later, it was 3 times the amount. Barack Obama raised at least $850 million, a staggering sum. He was essentially the #1 recipient of funds across the finance sector, from hedge funds, from investment banks, from commercial banks. So there is a danger that there will be demobilization. He's going to rely, he has a lot of chips. He's going to have to cash in for the corporations and the wealthy that backed him. And I agree with Bob that we need to be thinking about really more progressive ideas, and we need to challenge the issue of regulation. We've had a century of regulation, and the fact of the matter is I don't think it's really going to work. The finance sector spent 12 years and something like $300 million during the 80s and 90s to repeal Glass-Steagall Act, which was one of the landmark pieces of legislation during the Roosevelt era that separated commercial banking and investment banking. The idea, the purpose was to ensure that we don't get these types of bubbles again. And so this was repealed, and less than 10 years later, we have this absolute economic disaster. I think we should talk about nationalizing commercial banking and to ban derivatives trading, those exotic financial instruments that are the root of much of this trouble.
Robert Kuttner, it's not only the people that are being talked about as the Treasury sector or the economy men and women. What about, for example, Rahm Emanuel now has accepted the job of Chief of Staff. He will be determining who gets Barack Obama's ear outside of Barack Obama. He, too, the top recipient of donations from hedge funds, private equity firms, and the larger securities investment industry in the 2008 election cycle.
Yep, very, very center-right. On the other hand, things change. I mean, Roosevelt campaigned on a balanced budget, and once he started serious public works spending, his budget director resigned in protest. This is going to move very quickly. I just want to come back to social movements. Yes, a lot of money was spent by the Obama campaign to help mobilize young people, but you can't just turn that off with a switch. That's the great thing about